the providence has brought us together to worship on a day which is dear unto us, for this was the rule under which we were in the militia of the Lord in Italy and here in Ireland at Kilnacrot. Indeed, in Italy we had retained the custom of singing, actually, a part of the rule on a daily basis in chapter, and then there would be the chapter of faults, in which one would accuse oneself of various things that weren't correct on the external level. The custom that we had retained was still that of prostration before the community, and then one was given a penance and told to arise. It maintained actually discipline very well. Once the chapter of faults goes, many things go with it. Indeed, St. Norbert wanted 3 things always maintained. One was the chapter of faults, mutual correction. The other was cleanliness with regard to all that pertains to the altar. And that is something that one does see in good premonstratensian houses. Cleanliness, brightness, everything, as we would say, spick and span, nothing dingy, only the best for the Lord. And indeed, in Italy we had maintained the custom of daily, fully sung Missa Summa at the heart of the morning, 9:15, with incense every day, even on a weekday. And then the third element, which he insisted upon always to be there in any of his houses, was the question of accoglienza, welcoming, that one should be welcoming unto people, pilgrims and guests, because one meets and honours the Lord in the person who comes at the door, something that is valid for any Christian, that one treats the person coming to one as Christ, and on that we are judged. Which brings us back to the spirituality also of St. Augustine and to the first reading, all about loving God in our love for each other. And that is the advantage of the rule of St. Augustine, that there is not all that much emphasis on detail. It's about actual big, broad lines. It's about 1/5 the size of the rule of St. Benedict. St. Benedict gives actually all the details, and hence one does find those details in any good Benedictine monastery. There is a certain element finding itself to the surface always in a good Benedictine monastery. They are there, those specific things that have been given by St. Benedict. The stamp is there, e.g. the structure of the divine office and the like, night silence and so on. With regard to St. Augustine, it's more an insistence on the concreteness of charity. And he does go into detail about how to handle pain that has been caused. That, for instance, if one has said a word that has hurt, it must be the same mouth that makes the apology, for from the mouth must come the sweetness of the healing from which the bitterness has streamed. And he, in his other writings, goes on in the same vein, because he does actually, even in the rule, indicate the way in which the meals should be taken. That is, that one should do that also in a spirit of charity. But he elsewhere is known to have written in his own refectory, it may have been written by the one who wrote about him after he died, one of his disciples. We know that he had painted on the wall that there is no place here for anyone who eats his neighbour, that is to say, anyone who devours his reputation or criticises him, especially in his absence. So charity is very concrete. He is known also to have uttered at one point, "I cannot live without friendship," and he actually wrote a De Amicizia on friendship. So he knows what it's about, and it is his concrete expression of this gospel that we have, or this first reading from St. John that we have had. In other words, the whole thrust of the Augustinian spirituality is not that which therefore would lead to emphasis on a huge amount of detail, obscuring the essence, and that is always the danger, that we can actually be fairly keen on getting certain details correct, and for that to happen bypassing the essence. which they must serve and not destroy. So that is an advantage, because after all, every rule is only an invitation to be faithful to the gospel. It's as it were a condensé of the gospel, any rule. It's the channeling of its spirit into a specific family. It is actually also interesting that he, without of course any vocation's drive as we would know it, was a magnet, and he just drew people precisely because of this warmth, which comes also across in all his pastoral work. He was a great bishop and a great carer. He handled people well, and he handled the business of the church well, because the bishop in those days had to do everything. And he already, when he had this conversion in 387, at that point already calmed down a lot. And the first thing he did really was to have a prolonged quiet time with friends. Again, friends coming here already. And they had a philosophical monastic life of reflection, reading and study, with prayer, in a quiet country place. He went back to Africa for that to happen. Alypius was one of his faithful companions from the beginning. And then he was invited to be ordained for Hippo, and then unexpectedly the bishop died, Valerian, and he was acclaimed and invited to become bishop in his place, so he saw the will of God in that. But again the pattern continued. People came with him, and already as a priest he'd had these people with him, priests, but then he became a bishop with his priests. So that was a powerful institution. The episcopium was a place where these clerics were living together, praying together, and imagine the power of prayer that would produce. And in fact they were well formed. Remember, we have a great doctor, one of the 4 great doctors of the West, recognized as such by the East, and he then was able to form them with good doctrine and spirituality, and these were the future bishops of North Africa, because in those days there were bishops all over the place. We can see the thing actually in Rome until these recent years, but a very large number of bishops in Rome, because every town of any importance had a bishop. That goes right back to the early church. Well, it was like that in Africa too. And so these were often people who had been living with St. Augustine, so that gave a very good episcopacy to North Africa. With regard to his doctrine, it is interesting. He had very good Latin, and that's based on the fact that he was in Carthage, where Latin was massively spoken, and good Latin. There's a whole school of spirituality there in Carthage. We have Cyprian and so on, also writing in very good Latin, Tertullian also, and these were giving the church a language. Now remember, we're in the first centuries, and these were giving a Latin of theology and philosophy, and that was important. In Rome itself, Latin of course was important, but so was Greek, because it was the place where so many slaves and people from the Mediterranean basin were coming, and so Greek was actually a bit like English today. We have Juvenal complaining about that, this pollution, as it were, coming into the heart of Rome. But that's not the question. In Carthage, then, this was happening, and he also was giving, bit by bit, a thought pattern to the church, which then formed the Western thinking through the Middle Ages up to our time. Now, there is one thing to be aware of. These early theologians were the first. We presume that they're doing something which is normal. They're not. They're actually having to think it out for themselves. Remember that he was born in around 354. That's not long after the permission given to practice Christianity socially. The Edict of Milan was only really a generation or so before then, 2 at the most. So here we are, these people now able to function, and therefore he wrote a lot, a whole library in fact. And so he was keen on getting every word right, knowing how these were being actually multiplied by scribes, kept for posterity, and they were, all that volume, practically the whole lot, because of its value, and therefore he was aware that these had to be correct. because people were listening to him. And so at the end of his life, he went over the whole lot. Volumes and volumes and volumes, making sure there wasn't any error. And if they found anything which was not correct, if he himself found anything which was slightly doubtful, he would correct it in this last part of his work, the retractationes of all that he had written. So we have the complete Augustine by the time he dies in 430. So just to bear in mind, this question of de amicizia matters unto us. Here we are actually in this quiet farm in a situation where that is the case, because simple as is a good monastery, there's no artificial noise, and animals do actually lead to, as it were, a union with the Lord, because they're innocent and they do in some way bind with us, don't they? They're dependent on us. And animals know when there's goodness around in their own way. But also in the country here, there is a link with the Creator insofar it's not contaminated by artificialdom, and it needn't be. So that liberates the mind. But there is also in this place an element of sharing prayer, grace, and giving honour to God. Therefore, by having an oratory where only that happens, it's inviting the Lord to be king of the house and farm. That is bound to come back. He will honour a family which does that and bless that family. But also it has to be lived out in one continuity of movement, as in a monastery, that one always stays in mode of serenity and living out that life of grace in lived charity. That's why it's very difficult for a couple who is not marrying in Christ to live that, because even if it's a good human relationship, that condivision, that sharing of grace and supernatural life and prayer cannot really be there. It's dysfunctional, it's halting, it's not balanced. Whereas a family where very much grace is flowing in the veins and God is centre stage is different. It's like a monastery. And indeed that was the spirituality that John Paul II was proposing, a domestic church. And if a family is thinking of setting up that, it's important that that from the beginning should be the optic, excluding what is actually an invitation to Satan to destroy it from within. Either a monastery or a family which invites Satan in through enthroning the goggle box in the heart of the family is asking for trouble. It's abdicating and saying we also want the latest. Well, what has always worked, always will work. Silence and simplicity always has worked for the soul, and charity is not that complicated.
Cavan, come on. You follow it.
Good evening, good evening.
You should sit and play.
We are all ruminating, meditating on profound truths. Yes, indeed we are. Yes. Yeah, indeed, I agree. I say, you see, we get the Abbey, yes, indeed. Yes, that's the Hebdom. He's striking up there for Vespers. Indeed he is, yes. He's on tune as well. Bang on. Good night. Have you said Compline yet?